Good afternoon. My name is Erwin Chemerinsky, and I have the great pleasure of being the Dean of the Law School here at Berkeley. This particular program is a part of a series which we're calling Democracy Town Hall that's involving many of the schools on campus putting together programs with regard to cutting-edge issues for democracy in the United States in 2020 and 2021. I want to express my thanks to Dean Rocker Ray, who's chairing this initiative, and all of the members of the planning committee. Many schools are participating, and each of the schools is doing a program. We're trying to do about one a month. And when the planning was going on, it was thought it'd be good to have the law school do the program in November, a couple of weeks after the election. Of course, at that moment, we couldn't know whether this would be like 2000. We're in the midst of litigation that would decide the outcome of the election, or whether everyone would know on election day who had won. And of course, what we're going to talk about now is, are we closer to 2000 or are we closer to everyone having known on election day? I want to begin by thanking those who are responsible for putting the program together, Themby Ann Jackson and Jenny Boyden from our events service, Alex Shapiro, our director of communications, Whitney Mello, my assistant. An enormous amount of effort has to go into putting together a program like this. And most of all, I want to thank the four speakers who have come to be with us today. One thing about being an election law expert in a presidential election year, and especially this one, is they have been tremendously in demand, and they are all overwhelmed with invitations. And I'm so grateful that the four people who I invited, who are really the top election law experts in the country, were willing to make an hour for us for this program. I'm going to do very brief introductions. I apologize to each of them for the brevity, but I could spend the whole hour just telling you their qualifications, and the 60 minutes is going to go fast. And I'll introduce them alphabetically. Professor Rick Hasen is Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Jessica Levinson is Professor of Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. Professor Bertrall Ross is professor here at Berkeley Law. He's Chancellor's Professor of Law here. And Professor Franita Tolson is an Associate Dean and Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. What we're going to be doing for about the next 45, 50 minutes is having a conversation where I'll pose questions to the panelists and try to focus on those that are likely to be in the minds of many people in our audience across campus. And then we'll use the opportunity that we have for the remaining time for questions and answers. If you're listening in on the Zoom, please feel free to type your questions and answers in the Q&A function. If you're listening in through other media, then you can also submit the questions to that way, and they'll be relayed to me. And we'll get to as many of the questions as we can in our last 10 to 15 minutes. But most of all, my hope was that this would be a conversation among these leading election law experts. So let me begin the conversation by asking the question that I know many people are curious about. What current lawsuits are pending concerning the November 3rd presidential election? And what difference might they make in the outcome of the election? Rick, if I could start with you.
Sure. And let me say first, that's great to be with all of you. And I've been saying no to a lot of events, but I could never say no to Erwin, my friend and former boss. And as a Berkeley undergraduate alumnus, go Bears, I can't say no to Berkeley. So glad to be with you. Let me start with the bottom line. The bottom line is that I see no reasonable path for the Trump campaign to litigate in this election from defeat to victory. And so let me explain why that is, and then talk a little bit about the lawsuits. As things stand right now, it appears that Joe Biden will capture 306 electoral college votes, which is 36 more than he needs to get the majority in the electoral college, which a 270 would be the majority. And in the states that make up the closest electoral college victories, it does not appear that there are either legal problems nor administration problems such that a recount or a piece of election litigation is likely to change the results in even one of those states, much less in all of the states. I'd say the most serious litigation right now is taking place in Pennsylvania. And we have one state that's currently going through a recount, which is Georgia. And the other places where there's some action has been Michigan and Wisconsin. On Wednesday at 5 o'clock sharp, Central Time, the deadline will come for a recount in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is approximately 20,000 vote victory for Joe Biden. The average amount by which a statewide recount changes votes is in the hundreds of votes. It will cost $7.9 million, which the Trump campaign would have to pay to cause that recount. And it's almost impossible that a recount would change the results with that kind of margin. Right now, we're in the middle of a recount in Georgia. This was ordered by the Secretary of State there, who's a Republican. There's been a lot of pressure to try to do something there. With the exception of one county, a county that missed about 2,500 ballots with their counting. In every other county so far that's finished their counting, the results have been almost identical to what they came up with before. This mistake in this one county will net President Trump, I think something like 700 or 800 votes, but the margin in Georgia right now is about 14,000. So recounts don't seem like they're going to go anywhere. Let me just speak briefly about the litigation. There have been a lot of lawsuits filed. Most of those lawsuits have failed. Some of them have alleged fraud, and the courts have found there was no significant evidence of fraud. Some of them have involved more significant legal questions, and I can leave this to the others to discuss. In Pennsylvania, in particular, there are two lawsuits that are worth noting. One has gone to the Supreme Court twice, and the court has declined to get involved twice and is now before the Supreme Court a third time. It involves the question as to whether ballots arriving between November 3rd and November 6th, as ordered by the state Supreme Court to be counted, actually have to be counted. And there's kind of a complex legal theory as to why they should or shouldn't be counted. But the important point in terms of changing the election outcome is that we think there are fewer than 10,000 ballots at issue. Maybe they would give Joe Biden a 7,000 vote padding, but Biden is ahead by, I think, now close to 70,000 votes. And so this would make no difference. And then the other lawsuit that's filed in federal court, there's going to be a hearing tomorrow. In that one, there were some broad claims, but thanks to a Third Circuit ruling that just came out involving issues of standing, that lawsuit has been whittled down to a very minor lawsuit over an attempt in some Pennsylvania counties to allow the curing or fixing of absentee ballots that had problems and not allowing that in other states. I think there are a lot of reasons why the court won't reach the merits of that decision, but even if it reached the merits and even if it sided with Trump, there are, not that many ballots at issue. We're talking about, I think, maybe a few thousand ballots, not enough to make the difference. And of course, even if somehow, miraculously, the Trump campaign was able to get Pennsylvania to flip, Pennsylvania represents only 20 electoral college votes. There are still enough other states making up well over the majority in electoral college for it to make any kind of difference. That's kind of an overview. There's lots more specifics, but I think I'll stop there.
It's a terrific overview. And of course, I want to ask the other panelists if there's anything you want to add in terms of litigation, but it'd also be interesting to the other panelists, why do you think all this litigation is being pursued in light of what Rick says? I realize that in itself isn't an election law question, but given what Rick says and how decisive it seems, why are they continuing to pursue all of these lawsuits?
I can chime in here, Erwin. I think that part of this is about litigating these issues in the court of public opinion, as opposed to courts of law, because for a while leading up to the election, there was chatter about trying to convince Republican state legislators to appoint their own slate of electors in the event that the election failed, which is something that federal law speaks to. So under federal law, if there's a failure to elect a slate on November 3rd, then the state legislature has the authority to appoint its own slate. And so I think part of this was an attempt to sort of win the public messaging about there being these voting irregularities in order to call the outcome of the election into doubt. And so even then, that was very unlikely to happen. I don't think that people would peacefully allow the state legislature to disenfranchise them. And also because the there's been very little in terms of administrative. Of course, there's errors every election, right? But there's been very little wrong in terms of how election administrators conducted this election. In fact, they did an admirable job, given the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and given the pressure on election administrators in recent months to try to make accommodations, given the increase in people voting by mail. They did a really remarkable job. And so I do think that even that was a reach, to the extent that, one, you could keep the state from certifying their election results, which would also be difficult if there are no real irregularities. But two, convincing state legislators, even if they're Republican, to basically say that the election failed, and so we're going to disenfranchise X amount of people and appoint our own slate. I do think that was still a reach as well. But part of this was about public messaging.
That's a great point. Could I ask you or one of the other panelists to speak a bit more about, is there any reason to fear that the Republican-controlled state legislatures in, say, Pennsylvania or Michigan could declare it a failed election and give the electors of that state to Donald Trump? As recently as the end of last week, the governor of Florida was urging this. Many of us read an article in the Atlantic sometime before the election talking about this as a possibility. Do you want to describe a little bit about what it would take and why we shouldn't worry about it?
So it would take, and I'm gonna steal some of Rick's language. I think he called this 3 Hail Marys. But it would take, so it would take a failed election, and then the Republicans state legislators would presumably appoint their own state slate. Let's say election administrators still decide to certify the election results, right? Like the election is conducted under rules adopted prior to the election. And so if election administrators have determined that there is no failure, they can, certify the results, have their own slate. Then you're looking at the possibility of 2 slates in Congress. And in that situation, both houses have to agree on the appropriate slate. If the Republicans hold the Senate, then it's likely that they may not come to an agreement about the appropriate slate. And then federal law provides that the executive of the state is the tiebreaker. And so the governor of Pennsylvania or Michigan could weigh in and choose which slate is the appropriate slate. And as you know, Erwin, both of those seats are held by Democrats. So even then, it's unlikely to come to the outcome that Donald Trump would prefer.
Bertrall, could I ask you to describe then what happens between now and January 20th? In light of what Rick said about the litigation, what Franita said is we don't really need to worry about the Republican-controlled state legislatures giving the votes to Donald Trump. What happens step by step?
Right. So December 8th is the certification deadline for the election. So the states have to certify the elections by December 8th. And part of the theory in terms of the litigation, the long shot baseless claims are being brought in court and being brought in multiple forms, is to potentially delay that certification. So if you have ongoing lawsuits, the argument could be that we can't certify the election until these lawsuits are resolved. And so I see the Trump campaign doing some flooding of the zone in hopes that perhaps they could achieve that outcome. I think that that's unlikely given the weakness and the baselessness of these claims that are being brought and the efficiency with which the courts are resolving these disputes. But December 8th, the states have to certify the elections. Now December 14th, they meet and ultimately and the electors are sent to Congress, and the Congress counts the electors in early January, I believe January 3rd. And then after the Congress decides on who won the election based on the count of the electors, Joe Biden is sworn in on January 20th. And so that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at. I think December 8th is a critical date. December 8th is a critical date in terms of thinking about transition as well. The General Service Administrator is unwilling to ascertain the winner based on the counts right now. But it seems that she would have to by December 8th. Hopefully she would do so sooner, because the time that's delayed in the transition process is imposing potential great cost to our country in the middle of a pandemic. But that's kind of the timeline going forward.
Jessica, if I could ask you a follow-up to that. Bertrall says there's the date, and I think it's January 6th, that Congress counts the votes and actually determines who's the president. Is there any latitude that Congress has to do other than what the Electoral College says? given that the Republicans will be in control of the Senate on January 6th, is there anything they can do to make Donald Trump president?
I don't think so at that point. I think that the answer is that Congress is really certifying the results as opposed to, which is part of the process is counting, but I don't think that Congress has the power to say, I'm just kidding. And my fellow panelists will correct me on this. A couple things I wanted to pick up on. Of course, Rick did this amazing job of giving an overview of the litigation. And one thing that Rick has mentioned, and people have pointed out, it's really important to look at what's happening outside of the courtroom, what's being said outside, and compare that to what's being actually said in the filings here, because that's different. We're speaking to, an audience of lawyers. Obviously, when we sign something for a court of law, that carries with it a different weight, and there's different penalties attached if we're misrepresenting ourselves. So one of the things I think is important for people to key in on as we're all watching the news is also to look at what's actually being filed and what's actually being alleged here. There have been some really incredible exchanges between the Trump's legal team and judges. One of them, I feel like now it's famous, it's probably 3 days old, where the judge says, so are there actually people in the room who are watching the votes being counted? And the lawyer said, well, there's not a non-zero, or there is amount of people in the room watching, meaning, yes, of course there's people in the room watching. And then in a different situation, we had a judge saying, as counsel, as a member of the bar, which to me is the, please don't lie to me under oath. You are an attorney. You better be careful of what you're saying here. So one of the things, again, is this disparate, this huge gulf between what's being alleged outside, and then inside the courtroom, we have things being said like, yeah, there's probably just a good faith situation where there's a mistake here, as opposed to outside, there's terrible voter fraud, our democracy is failing. And part of that, I think, is because of the question that you asked, Franita, which is, why are we doing this? And I think we're doing this because the lawsuits give the political arguments the veneer of legitimacy, at least to some people, right? It is the idea of, I'm not just telling you there was voting fraud. I'm not just telling you there's corruption in the system. I'm not just telling you everything's rigged. Look at what I did. I actually filed a lawsuit to try and back that up. Of course, pull back the lawsuit and it says something totally different. And which is all a very long way of not answering your question, Erwin. I think the answer to your question is, at that point, Congress really doesn't have a lot of discretion to say, gosh, I know that we added, and on this side it says 306 for Biden, but he doesn't seem like the nicest guy, and we didn't like the way he was biking that much, and so we're just going to go ahead and change that. So I think that's what they answer.
Do others have comments or thoughts about either the litigation that's pending or what's going to happen between now and January 20th before we shift to looking back at what occurred on November 3rd?
I actually do have something to add here, if that's okay. One thing I've been thinking about in recent days as things have wound down a little bit is how much of this we'll have to live with after this election cycle. And so one of the interesting things about all of the litigation, including litigation from prior to the election, is that arguments were made that I think we will have to entertain after the dust settles. So this question of the power of the state legislature relative to the other branches of the state government and the state legislature's power to set the rules for the election and the extent to which the state courts or election administrators can disturb those rules, I think is something that we'll have to contend with. So that came up in the context of the Pennsylvania litigation. Rick is absolutely right that, the ballots at issue will not change the outcome of the election. But I think the argument is definitely going to survive this election cycle. And much the way that Bush versus Gore, despite the fact that it is supposed to have no presidential value, has survived that that election cycle. I think we'll have to tackle some of the issues that have come up in the course of the litigation and the lawsuits that we've seen in the last few months.
It's an excellent point. And of course, the argument was made in a concurring opinion by Chief Justice Rehnquist, joined by Justice Scalia and Thomas in Bush versus Gore, that the Constitution gives to the legislature of the state the power to determine the rules for choosing the electors. So a court interpreting the state constitution shouldn't be able to do that. I have to admit, when I read that 20 years ago, I didn't think it was a very strong argument, because why shouldn't a state court be able to interpret state law in this or any other area? But that's the primary argument that the Republicans made in going to the Supreme Court to challenge the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's choice to extend the time for receipt of absentee ballots by 3 days. And we know that the justices split 4-4 before Justice Barrett was sworn in. So it's very much an issue that remains and will be there for future elections. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think it also is not just the courts, it's the state executive officers. So the challenge is also to the actions of the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so to the extent that they are defining legislature narrowly to only include the actual legislative body and not to include the executive and their responsibility to enforce the law, which will necessarily require interpretation of the law, that could have widespread, broad precedential effects on how we run elections into the future. And so I think Franita is right in terms of something to keep an eye on in terms of whether the court ultimately decides to embrace that theory. It came up in the Arizona State Legislature versus Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission case back in 2014, I believe. And so I think that this could arise in the court, and the court might have a different view on this issue than it had in Bush v. Gore.
In that case that you mentioned seemed to indicate that legislature refers to the lawmaking process generally, not to the body of the legislature, but that was 5-4 with Kennedy and Ginsburg in the majority, and the court has changed a lot since then.
Absolutely.
And let's not forget that the Electoral Count Act puts the tiebreaker in the executive, right? And if this view of legislature carries the day, then of course that becomes of questionable constitutionality.
It's a great point.
I wanted to go back before you go on to the future to a point that Jessica made about the lawyering, because I think that it's such a contrast if you think back 20 years ago to Bush versus Gore compared to what we're seeing now. So in Bush versus Gore, you had the elite lawyers from the Democrats and the Republicans lined up. You know, you had Ted Olson, you had Larry Tribe, you had David Boies, you had the really top lawyers in the country arguing these cases. And in this litigation, on the Democratic side, you see that as well. You see Don Verrilli and Seth Waxman, both former Solicitors General of the United States. But on the Republican side, it's been a different story. In part because I think the president has made such wild, unsubstantiated claims of fraud. It's been very unpopular, which are, I think, undermining the legitimacy of the upcoming Biden presidency. It's become unpopular for lawyers to be associated with these cases. And so there's been an attack on Jones Day, which has been representing the president. And I think it brought in $7 million in bills from the Trump campaign. But they issued a statement saying that they were not involved in any lawsuits alleging voter fraud. They're the ones involved in this case at the Supreme Court involving the independent state legislature doctrine that you just mentioned. And Porter Wright, which is a prestigious firm in Ohio, has withdrawn from the Pennsylvania litigation. And since we started this call, the lawyer who is now representing Pennsylvania has withdrawn. And who is a sole practitioner who does mostly divorce law, and she's been replaced by other lawyers. What seems to be going on, according to reporting that was in the New York Times and elsewhere, is that there's a power struggle going on the Trump campaign side. On the one hand, it sounds like there are more responsible voices that are advising the president that all of these legal claims are failing, and there is no legal path to try to change the election results. On the other hand, you have people like Rudy Giuliani, who's been advising the president, is one of the people put in charge of the legal strategy, who's been echoing Trump's wildly unsupported claims of fraud. And as Jessica said, it's one thing to stand in front of Four Seasons Total Landscaping and make a ridiculous statement. It's another thing to try to state it in a court. And there's been a lot of pushback over the fact that in that Pennsylvania case in federal court, the lawyers pretty much abandoned all of the claims that could have proven fraud or that could have provided a basis for trying to change the votes of 670,000 Pennsylvanians, as Giuliani and Trump have said. Maybe these lawyers have now changed because they're going to try to put outlandish claims now back before the court. But what I want to say, and my main point on this, is that the reason that more responsible lawyers are staying away is because they know that the courts have held. Courts are still places of law. And even though I and you and others have been critical of the courts sometimes letting their ideology sway how they decide issues like what legislature means. We have not seen courts engage in lawlessness, where they ignore the law, where they totally ignore precedent, and they issue opinions that I would consider to be lawless. And I think that's kind of a victory of what we're seeing, is that the courts are applying the usual rules. They're requiring the normal rules of evidence. They're requiring that you cite a precedent. And that is a positive development for those who are worried that the Trump presidency has been taking us down the road of norm violation and increasing lawlessness.
And there was a funny comment that went around, just to pick up on what Rick said, that when it was announced Rudy Giuliani is going to take over the legal strategy and the political strategy, and this will be Rudy Giuliani captaining the ship, there was a collective kind of on Twitter, oh, so this is the concession. Like, we're never going to get closer to a concession than we will with this particular decision.
Let me ask a different question. As you look back at 2 weeks ago, November 3rd, do you see a problem with regard to voter suppression that we need to be addressing for the future? And if so, what was the problem and what do we need to do?
I have a lot to say about this.
Please start a conversation.
So one of the narratives that came out of this presidential election cycle was the fact that people were excited and motivated and interested because of the stakes, and there was just so much excitement about voting. This is why there were long lines. And I just think context is important, right? In a lot of states, particularly states that used to be covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, they took steps to make voting harder since 2013, since the Shelby County decision. I think that is important context for understanding some of the long lines in Georgia and in other places, and some of the difficulties that people had in voting in both the primary and the general election. And so, when that context is missing, I think that we overlook the fact that we still have work to do. In future elections, they may not be as high interest, but we still need to work on making sure that people are able to vote who are legally capable of casting a ballot. And so I don't want that to get lost in the narrative, which is why I keep coming back to this idea that this is a lot of what we saw this election cycle was the fruition of a years-long effort to make it harder to vote. And so we should not overlook that in thinking about how to move forward.
And let me just say for the audience, what Franita was referring to is that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act said that jurisdictions that had a history of race discrimination voting needed to get prior approval before they had a significant change in their election system. And the Supreme Court effectively declared that unconstitutional in the Shelby County versus Holder case. And so this then leads to the ability of states to put in things that make it harder, especially for people of color, to vote. Do others have thoughts about the issue of voter suppression in light of what Franita said?
So I would say that, it wasn't as bad as we feared, but there's a lot of concern that still remain with respect to this election. I have a lot of concerns about future elections in particular. There were certainly efforts in several states, for example, Florida, to go against the popular preferences of the people to enfranchise persons with felony conviction. The legislature passing a law that required those individuals with felony convictions to pay their fines and fees before they're able to actually exercise their right to vote. So there's efforts disfranchisement on that front. There were efforts in Texas to limit the number of drop boxes to 1 per county, which had a constraining effect. There was limits in terms of number of polling places available for early voting that contributed to long lines. There's also the longstanding efforts to apply and to enforce rigorous voter ID laws. But we still had an election, which it looks like about 150 million people voted, which is the highest turnout numbers that we've seen since the early parts of the 20th century. What I think is that this election and the way it was conducted caught those who are engaged in voter suppression practices a little bit off guard, because there were multiple channels to vote this election due in major part to the pandemic and due to the fact that public pressure on legislatures to create more opportunities to vote made it a little bit more challenging to try to suppress vote through all these channels. And combine that with what Franita says in terms of the motivation of individuals to vote contributed to this high turnout. But I'm still looking out for those numbers in terms of infrequent voters. And I fear that those infrequent voters who haven't voted in past elections, that I'll be curious in terms of what those numbers look like in terms of their turnout. What I'll say briefly and close in terms of future elections is that, you know, those who are engaged and stand to benefit from voter suppression won't be caught unaware in future elections. And what I imagine we'll see is efforts to roll back mail-in balloting, efforts to roll back early voting, efforts to make those two activities harder, to impose rigorous requirements in terms of voting as well. And those efforts will have a suppressive effect in future elections, I predict, based on how people are going to perceive and the narrative that's associated with this election, that mail-in voting benefits Democrats and early voting does as well. So that's my concern kind of going forward.
It actually goes to a question that I wanted to ask as we take the lessons from number third. Bertrall, you said you think that the lesson may be to make early voting and absentee voting more difficult. Is there a possibility that it would be the opposite? That since absentee balloting occurred at an unprecedented level without fraud, it's a genie that you can't put back into the bottle, that we're going to move ever more towards mail-in ballots, or am I being naive?
That would be my dream, but now that it's become partisan, now that it's seen by Republicans as bad for them, I think that there will be efforts on that partisan side to push for restrictions. Now, how do the people respond, right? The partisan argument is not going to be simply, it's bad for Republicans. It's just that there is fraud, and we have lawsuits that have been filed to prove it, even though those lawsuits went nowhere. And also, in addition to that, we don't have a pandemic anymore. We don't need to do it like this anymore. We could go back to the ordinary ways of doing things. So that's my concern. Maybe it's a genie out of the bottle. Maybe people found it so convenient. Maybe we go the path of Colorado, Washington, and California, which have widespread absentee ballot with little to no fraud. But I'm concerned that it'll become so politicized that there'll be a lot of pushback against it.
Rick and Jessica, your thoughts about the issues of voter suppression that we learned from November 3rd, and also this issue Bertrall and I were talking about is, which way do you think this election will take us with regard to absentee ballots?
So I think Bertrall's exactly right that there's somewhat of a paradox here. On the one hand, we had unprecedented levels of turnout. And despite the fact that we were holding a vote during a pandemic when we knew it was going to be exceptionally difficult, the efforts, Herculean efforts of election administrators and volunteers and postal workers made this a resounding success in terms of turnout. On the other hand, I was just really surprised by the levels at which some Republican legislatures and election officials went to try to make it harder for people to vote even during a pandemic. So to take the example of South Carolina, in South Carolina, if you want to vote by mail, you have to get a witness signature to verify who you are. And during the primary, a federal court issued an order that said, well, we're getting rid of this requirement during COVID because it's, even though it's not ordinarily that burdensome on voters to get this requirement, it is when you can't see your neighbors because of the pandemic. And that was just fine, and no one objected. When we got to the general election, the Republicans objected, and they litigated all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that the change came too late and that federal courts don't have any business deciding how to balance voting rights against health and safety measures. And so there, Bertrall mentioned the example of Texas that got rid of its drop boxes. The same thing happened in Ohio. There were so many places where stumbling blocks were put in front of voters for no good reason. And the fact that voters were able to overcome those stumbling blocks, that's something to celebrate voters, but it's not something to celebrate in terms of effort at suppression. Suppressive efforts sometimes create counter reactions where there is an effort to you put in a voter ID law, people work really hard to make sure that people can overcome that. But it doesn't make it any less suppressive. It doesn't make it any less objectionable, and it's not justified. Now, going forward, one of my greatest concerns is that Democrats and voting rights groups decided to push a number of cases to try to ease the burden on voting during a pandemic, even after the Supreme Court sent a signal that federal courts should not be making these changes. And along the way, we got some really terrible precedent about how to balance voting rights against state interests, terrible precedent about what the 26th Amendment means in terms of age discrimination in voting when it came to questions why voters in Texas over 65 can get an absentee ballot without an excuse, but voters under 65 cannot. Terrible precedents in terms of timing, manipulation of the so-called Purcell principle. Terrible precedents in terms of state legislatures having great authority, even against state courts applying state constitutions, and state election officials doing the normal job that they do in running elections. All of these things are going to come back to haunt us. And so I agree with Bertrall that in the future, to the extent that Republican legislatures think that it is to their advantage, as the Trump wing of the party does, to keep the electorate smaller, whiter, more rural, less diverse, we're going to see new efforts to suppress the vote. And lots of the accommodations that were made for COVID were only for this election. So we're going to go back to the bad stuff. And the federal courts and the Supreme Court are going to rubber stamp that suppression. So I am very pessimistic about the future of voting rights in this country after what we've been through, despite the fact that I consider this to be a mostly successful election, despite the federal appeals courts.
Jessica, I want to give you the chance to respond to what Rick and Bertrall and Franita said. But first, I just want to tell everybody, if you're watching on Berkeley Law's Facebook or YouTube channel, you can ask questions through that. And if you're watching via Zoom, you can put Q&A there. In about 10 minutes, we'll shift towards that part of it. Jessica, your thoughts? Do you agree with Rick in his pessimism?
I deeply resent Rick for doing that, because typically I'm the one who can be the pessimist in the room and I can be the rain on everybody's parade. And now that he has done that, there's really very little room for me. So I'll just point out a couple of things that we've already largely touched on. One is this, in terms of voter suppression, we looked at these huge lines in the days leading up to the election. And it is lunacy that we just say the election is November 3rd. Of course, the election was happening when we were confirming Justice Barrett. People were voting in record numbers. The election is something that happens over the course of weeks. And people were looking at these long lines and saying, look at democracy at work. And I just wanted to cry, because nobody should be in a line for 11 hours to try and cast their ballot, whether there is a pandemic or not. And this is just, so cry number one is the idea that in America in 2020, you have to set aside a day and be in physical shape to stand there for 11, 7, 2 hours. There's no reason that this should happen. Cry number two, the idea that this is a partisan issue. I mean, that to me, every time I talk about this, I know that people read this as me being, aggressively Democratic, or aggressively a member of the Democratic Party, I should say. And that's not actually the case. And the idea that it has become a political issue as to whether or not we want to make it easier or harder for you to vote is so incredibly dispiriting. And then we were probably going to get to this. Well, in terms of kind of is the genie out of the bottle for vote by mail and early voting? I tend to think it's going to be like everything, that in the blue states, they'll say, look how well that worked. No problems. We can accelerate what we were already doing. And then in red states, they'll just go back and it'll be even harder. And we will not implement any of these changes that make it easier to vote, with no increase in any of the things we worry about, with no increase in reducing the integrity of the system. And then, Erwin, when you said November 3rd, and everybody on the panel has already pointed this out on social media and elsewhere, the painful thing about November 3rd, it wasn't just the lines, it wasn't just the partisanship, it was the idea that it came in drips and drabs for no good reason. We could have had the results we could have had, Pennsylvania is called earlier, but because we have these laws in place that say don't start counting until the day before the election or the day of the election, it creates this narrative that, look, something strange happened. And of course, we all know nothing strange happened, but it takes at least 2 sentences to explain what the red mirage is and what the blue shift is. And then you're losing if you have to explain it.
Of course, Jessica, that's the result of each state getting to decide its own rules for elections. Some, yes, like Pennsylvania, didn't count the absentee ballots until election day or after. Some counted earlier. Is the solution more national regulation of elections? And is that even possible?
I don't know that it's possible. And I do feel a little anxious right now about more centralization of elections, in part because of what we're seeing with the President of the United States. There's some safety in everything being dispersed. There's some safety in the decentralization.
Let me ask this as a question. I think it's a great point. The story of the 2016 election has to include, at least in part, Russian interference and the role that Russian interference did or didn't play with regard to the outcome. As we talk about this election, we're not talking about foreign interference. And I'm interested for you as election experts, is that because it didn't happen this time? Or we did a better job of protecting our system from it? Or they just did it better, so we couldn't detect it? Why aren't we talking about foreign interference for this election like we did in 2016?
So there were 3 things that the Russians did in 2016, according to the reports of the Intelligence Committee. Number 1, they stole emails from Democratic campaign officials, including John Podesta, and they leaked them, and they contained embarrassing information. That didn't happen this time. We saw an attempt to try to leak some Hunter Biden emails, maybe because they didn't exist, or maybe because they weren't sufficiently embarrassing. That didn't seem to resonate. The second thing the Russians did in 2016 was they probed the voter registration databases of all 50 states, and maybe monkeyed around in one state last time. They did the same thing this time. It's just that in the flood of all of the misinformation about the election, it got less attention. And then the third thing that happened in 2016 was that the Russians engaged in a disinformation campaign, spreading false information about Hillary Clinton, also a campaign to try to divide people, make them more polarized. For this, the Russians did this again, as did some other countries. But Trump so flooded the zone with the same activity that much of the Russian activity consisted mostly of simply retweeting the president. And so he was the source of disinformation. He was the biggest source of disinformation in this election. The Russians couldn't have done a better job because no one has a 87 million follower megaphone like Donald Trump. And so if we were in a normal election season, that Russian activity might have seemed significant. But because Trump was so over the top in what he did, it just flooded the zone of everything else. And just to say as a bottom line, that means I don't think we can relax about what the next election is going to look like. That's the topic of a book I'm supposed to be working on now, but we have to finish this election first.
I want to shift to questions in a moment, but let me, before I shift to questions, turn to each of the 4 of you and ask the following. What do you think is the most important lessons that should be drawn from the November 3rd election? Based on what you've said, it seems clear that Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated on January 20th. There's going to be some litigation going on, but none of you think it's likely to make a difference in the outcome. It seems clear that December 8th, the electors will be ascertained in the states. December 14th, they'll vote. January 6th, Congress will certify the election. So what do you think is the most important thing that we should learn from all of this?
I guess I'll start.
Go ahead.
I just want to start on a positive note, kind of emphasizing the success that I deem this election to be in agreement with Rick. We just ran an election during a pandemic when there's many doubts on the capacity of states to do so. And the primaries reinforced those doubts because they didn't go particularly well during the pandemic. And yet the elections operated well. There has been very little mismanagement. And I think the important point I take from this as a voting rights person is that if we open up multiple channels to vote, right, you limit the opportunity for those who want to engage in suppressive activities to suppress the vote, because you give people multiple chances and multiple ways to vote. My fear is that if you have an all in-person election, right, efforts to intimidate voters at the poll, deter them, to limit the number of polling places in minority neighborhoods, all those efforts are much more effective as you force people to wait in 12, 14, 16-hour lines. But if you open up a channel in those same elections in which you can vote early, in which, you know, perhaps the lines will be shorter one day, or even vote by mail, then that could provide different access channels for individuals to vote and participate in elections. And I think that that should be the lesson that we take away from this election about how do we create broader opportunities for inclusion. Well, this is one way to do so, but I fear this won't be the lesson that we take away with this election. But yeah,
I'm happy to follow Bertrall in part because I think that my recommendation aligns with his, this idea that we need to figure out ways to be more inclusive. But I just want to point out that there's another concern here that also sort of demands that be one of the focuses moving forward, is that there's been a lot of talk this election cycle about voter fraud and calling into question the legitimacy of the election and various attacks on democracy. And it's really important that we not just assume that America is destined to be. Right. And the success in running an election in which north of 150 million people turn out, there's always some risk that you end up thinking that we can survive anything. But nothing is guaranteed, right? We are on the other end of like aging democracies. And so I think it's really important to understand that if we don't find a way to be inclusive, the risk is not that, you know, there'll be fraud or any of that stuff. The risk is that people will lose faith in the system because they'll have to work so hard to be a part of it. We cannot continue to live in an election system in which people have to work so hard in order to vote, in order to make their voices heard. Because then if sufficient numbers of people check out, then that is the true risk to democracy. And our system cannot be carried by, you know, favoring rural voters who live in red states and making it easier for them to vote. While excluding people who don't fall within that demographic and thinking that American democracy can continue on. It just doesn't work like that. And so, in my opinion, the risk of essentially our success, right? We were successful this time in pulling off an election, but the risk of that is forgetting that we have a lot to work on, and in order for our democracy to continue, we have to be concerned about the people who were left behind.
Jessica, Rick?
Rick, please go ahead.
Sure. I'm pessimistic about the near future. I think there are going to be some very negative ramifications of the president claiming and convincing millions of his followers that this election was stolen. I think that evidence and truth seems to matter less. And I think that while there have always been people who believe false things, including false things about elections, the virality of social media and the means by which people can use social media to further their incorrect worldviews means this kind of siloing means that positions are going to harden. And in such a polarized atmosphere, and when we're so closely divided, I mean, look, Biden wins by 7 million votes in the Electoral College, but Democrats are going to barely squeak by in the House. And we know what happens in midterm elections. Usually the president's party loses seats. It's an extremely closely divided country. And when it's so closely divided and people see these elections as having an existential quality to them, then you start seeing efforts to suppress the vote as a means of trying to maintain power. And that makes me really, really concerned.
Jessica?
I feel like I'm supposed to say something optimistic after that, but my takeaway was actually, I started thinking about when you asked Rick about Russia and foreign interference. And my takeaway is that this was in no way a repudiation of, as I view it, this was in no way a repudiation of Trumpism or the GOP in the way that I, in my bubble, would have expected living through 4 years of the Trump administration. And why is that? In part, I think because of disinformation. And it's not just from foreigners. It's not just from foreign influence, I should say. It's also domestic. And I think this is one of the big takeaways that I have, which is not only that we're divided, not only that we're tribal, but we're divided on what the facts are. We're divided on what the basic reality is. And for me, that's a scary place. And I really think we have to, going forward, do essentially two things. One, we have to confront this issue of disinformation, of media literacy. We have to get back to a place where we all basically agree on, yes, this is a baseball field. There are 4 bases. And then you fight, you play the game. This is as far as my sports analogy can possibly go. But you don't fight about whether or not there's actually 4 bases on the field. And right now we're fighting over, what type of field even is it? So we have to get to disinformation. We have to get to literacy. And then something that Franita was talking about, we have to get to a place where we don't think you are an engaged citizen if you vote every 2 to 4 years. That does not an engaged citizen make. We have to get to a place where we think we're having a conversation with our elected representatives, and we ask both sides more of each other. And I hope that the takeaway from the 2020 election is something that we can take and do better, because I don't think we did a great job on those things this time around.
We received a lot of questions, and we have the 10 minutes I promised for them. Let me pose as many as I can in our remaining time. One question that came in is, what can we learn from countries where elections are more functional?
So one thing we can say is the United States is an outlier. Almost every other advanced democracy in the world besides the United States uses national nonpartisan election administration, where the people that run the elections have their primary allegiance to the integrity of the process rather than to a political party. And further, these bodies are insulated from normal political pressures. And there's uniformity across the country when national elections are run. We are the outlier, and it's really hard to see that when you're in the United States, but you can look at South Korea, you could look at other countries that have run elections during the pandemic, and they did not have the kind of struggles that we have had either politically or logistically in running a safe and fair election during a pandemic.
If none of the panelists want to speak to that question, I'll pose another question from the audience. How did the recent changes at the United States Postal Service contribute to voter suppression?
I can speak to that. So I do think that it was intended to make it harder for people to vote by mail, but I don't think it succeeded in the sense that people planned. So a lot of the public messaging was, if you haven't mailed your ballot yet, find a drop box, right? And I do think people heeded the message about bending the absentee ballot curve and requesting their ballots and also in casting their ballots. So the public messaging around that from both election officials, election scholars, public commentators, everybody about the importance of getting your ballot in early, I think it resonated with voters. And so we didn't see as much as of a success in that effort. But I do think that it was an attempt to make it difficult for people to get their ballots in on time. Because if you look at it coupled with the litigation challenging the extension of ballot receipt deadlines, it seemed very much like a concerted effort by the Trump campaign to make vote by mail difficult. And one other thing to your other question, I think that automatic voter registration will be really terrific. I do think that's something that could happen on the federal side and something that would go a long way towards making voting easier in this country. So other countries can do it, we can do it.
Unless there's comments, I'll ask another question that we got from the audience. Is there a national database of all voting rights claims? And the question that goes on about why it would be valuable to have that. Does anyone keep track of all the voting rights claims in a single place?
There has been an attempt to follow all the COVID-related litigation. You can go to healthyelections.org. There's another database that's my colleague Justin Levitt and Jessica's colleague Justin Levitt maintains at the Election Law blog. The Ohio State Election Law Project also has a database of major cases in litigation, but there's no single voting rights depository of all cases that I'm aware of.
I'll ask the next question. Professor Ross mentioned Florida's Amendment 4. So people who have been convicted of felonies have been continually disenfranchised. Given the 11th Circuit ruling upholding the amendment, Do you think other states will try to adopt such re-enfranchisement schemes, essentially adopting a pay-to-vote scheme? Let me just explain for those who aren't familiar with it, and then I'll turn to the panel to answer. Florida voters passed an initiative to allow ex-felons to be able to vote. When people have served their prison time, their jail time, they would be able to vote. The Florida legislature then adopted a law that said they could do so only if they paid their fines and fees. A district court found that that was impermissible because it's akin to what the Supreme Court had declared a poll tax. You can't make people pay in order to vote. But the 11th Circuit reversed, with the Republican appointed judges saying that this was permissible and the Democratic appointed judges saying it was impermissible. And it's estimated there are about 750,000 ex-felons in Florida who could be kept from voting for failure to pay the fines and fees. And I think the question is, does this tell us anything about what might go on in other states?
I think it definitely provided an opening. I think that Florida is unique in terms of overturning its felons enfranchisement law by a popular initiative. So to the extent that a state doesn't have popular initiative and the state legislature is not inclined to allow persons with felony convictions to vote if they haven't completed their probation and parole, they're probably going to maintain that law. But what it does give an opportunity to do is perhaps provide an add-on to that law to the extent that they are concerned about particular people voting by adding a fines and fees provision to their felons enfranchisement laws to the extent that they don't already have one. So the 11th Circuit provided a potential opening in differentiating between those fine and fee requirements in a poll tax. And that could have potentially large ramification, because what Florida showed us is that it's not simply the challenge of these individuals paying their fines and fees. It's about knowing whether they owe fines or fees at all, and the deterrent effect that that has, because if they vote or try to vote having owed fines and fees, they could potentially be criminally prosecuted. So I think that those are the sort of effects of those particular laws, and they could have broad effects to the extent that states are inclined to adopt them as a means to further disenfranchise individuals in their states.
Can I jump in here? I think that, so I agree with everything Bertrall has said. I do think that there are states that require payment of fines and fees as a condition for re-enfranchisement, but I take Bertrall's larger point about sort of thinking about a path forward. Florida was unusual in a sense, at least in my head, because it seems like the voters wanted one thing, but the state legislature wanted another. And so even if you have some states that permit that, it wasn't entirely clear to me that that the voters intended Florida to be one of them, right? And so to me, that makes that situation a bit unusual, because we were clear on what the legislature was trying to do. And we were also clear in this idea that it might actually undermine the intent of the voters in a way that's problematic. And I don't think that, the 11th Circuit really grappled with that issue any. And so I agree. I don't want to take away from anything Bertrall said, but in my mind, Florida just sort of stands out a little bit different, because there is this conflict between what the state legislature did and what the voters thought they were voting for.
We have some more terrific questions. I worry that we're out of time, though. I think at this stage, I'll apologize to those whose questions I didn't get to. They're great questions, and we could continue the discussion for a long time. And the reality is this discussion is going to go on for a long time. There's so much to be learned from what happened on November 3rd. I, again, really want to thank our four terrific panelists: Rick Hasen from UCI Law School, Jessica Levinson from Loyola Law School, Bertrall Ross from Berkeley Law, and Franita Tolson from USC Gould School of Law. As I said at the beginning, they're all tremendously in demand this month. It's been a very difficult time for them to keep up with all of the demands, plus their teaching and writing and all of that they have to do. And so I'm grateful to them for taking the hour here. This has been a wonderful discussion. Each of you has just been great during this panel, and I'm very grateful to each of you. And again, very thankful to all in our audience who've tuned in. I think you've been watching these four people, just hearing a great discussion. So with that, I'll say thank you to everybody. Take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erwin.